even know that. Canadians don't realize that, their government is leading the way with sanctions on a country that could kill 1 million people. Sanctions could kill more people than war potentially, right? Because if you bombed a nuclear plant, it would just be the nuclear plant. That would be bad enough and a war crime in itself, a violation of Iranian sovereignty. But the sanctions, that's denying food, medicine, and all the necessary staples that people need in their everyday lives. That's denying that through sanctions. And so Canadians don't realize that. And so to talk about that, to get people at least the facts is what we can do, right? And we're very disempowered, let's be honest. We're not in power, but we have the ability to speak. We have the ability now, cameras and internet paraphernalia, computer hardware and different pieces of equipment that we need. It's affordable now. When I went in to buy my equipment, I was moaning and groaning, and the guy said, look, this would have cost $50,000 some time ago. Now it's $5,000 to get yourself set up with broadcasting equipment, right? So we have the ability to use the internet not only to build bridges with those countries that are being prepared for war and to have their national sovereignty violated. They obviously want to move on. They've done the Iraq war, they've done Libya, they've done Syria. Canada led the way with the Libya regime change. It's quite a radical thing to go around the world changing people's governments for them. It's very paternalistic. The idea that the Libyan people can't choose who their government is. And it's always sold to us that, we're just helping the people. But usually what these Western states are doing is they're siding with one faction, right? They're taking sides in complex historic sectarian disputes, right? So a good example is right now in Mali, right? The Canadian government just sent a big aeroplane over to Mali to back up a military junta, a military dictator, at the cost of $18.6 million to the taxpayer just to send one plane. I mean, you'd think that, with student debt ballooning, with healthcare being underfunded, with old age care being underfunded in this country, that we should be spending such money on perfecting our own society first, especially when you have international human rights organizations increasingly scrutinizing Canada, its mistreatment of Aboriginals, the failure to adhere to the treaties and the promises and pledges made to First Nations in this country. Human Rights Watch just published a damning report on that subject, indicting the police in British Columbia. So we have our own problems, and yet we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money flying around the world to reshape and engage in social engineering in other people's countries. And I think a lot of people think that's a flawed foreign policy, and I think it's making Canada increasingly unpopular in world of public opinion,
Most definitely. Now centralizing our focus on Canadian endeavors here in politics, obviously some discontent with the current Conservative government and Stephen Harper. You've expressed many times your distaste for the Conservative government in Canada, as well heavy involvement with the Idle More movement. We'll start off, Josh, by getting you to tell us a little bit about your involvement with Idle More No More, because I know you're a big advocate for Aboriginal rights as well. So tell us a little bit about your advocacy for Aboriginal rights and your involvement with the Idle No More movement, and how you feel that made a difference and impacted Canada as far as a step forward in political future.
I first came to this part of the world because my mother was interested in native issues. We used to go to Montana every summer from Britain. That's how I came to know this part of the world. That's why I ended up living here. So the native issue was the reason that drew me to North America in the first place. I wouldn't have ever come here. Moreover, my mentor, Professor Anthony Hall, who I did 9/11 scholarship with, he is actually an Aboriginal, one of the foremost relating to Constitution, Aboriginal experts in Canada. And so luckily through him, I had a really good grounding in my studies in the laws pertaining to Aboriginal peoples in this country. He wrote 1,000-page, 2,000-page books, and I proofread the latter one, completely addressing the struggle of Indigenous peoples, especially the land question in BC, in a global context. And so I knew that when this Harper government got into power, you see, they prescribed this trickle-down economic theory, this neoliberal policy that you have to remove any obstacles to corporate power, because that's the only way you can really benefit everyone. You give carte blanche to corporations, they create jobs, and something will trickle down. That's the best we can do, right? Whereas others like me would say, well, no, we can use the state to usurp Canada's natural wealth and redistribute wealth, that the state should intervene and be a moral actor, right? And should, evaluate. The state could take a position, well, it might be economically rational for a corporation to get these, Indigenous peoples out of the way, but these Indigenous peoples have moral, legal, historic rights. So the state should be an arbiter, but he believes in a minimalist state, right? The Harper government believes I say he, Stephen Harper, the Harper government, Thomas Flanagan, his mentor at the University of Calgary, they believe in a kind of minimalist, conception of the state where you leave everything for corporations, for the private sector. And the Aboriginal issue is a real hindrance to that ideology, right? Because the Aboriginal peoples, they have treaties with the Crown, right? Like actually the way the British Empire formulated its policy with the indigenous peoples, it was still colonial and paternalistic and imperfect, but it was a lot better than what the States did, right? The States, it was literally like, let's just send in the cavalry and just remove them, right? Do overt genocide. In Canada, you had this first British, what was the 13 colonies that became Canada in a sense, because the people who were in the 13 colonies, the Brits, they were the founding fathers in a sense of Canada, along with Tecumseh, the Indian confederacy led by Tecumseh, who defended Canada in the War of 1812. They formed, Sir William Johnson was the first British Imperial Indian agent in the colonies. And he said, well, why don't we do treaties with these Indians? Why don't we win over their allegiance? So in 1763, you saw this amazing document, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, that basically said that we're not going to take from the Indians anymore. We're going to ask them and do treaties. And that was the foundation for our treaty system in Canada. And even in British Columbia to this day, you have treaties being negotiated. It's a really good model, because you think when you have disputes, you have two ways to do it. Either the more powerful person can just kill the weaker person and vanquish them, or you can do a treaty, right? That applies to Israel, Palestine, or elsewhere.
Absolutely. Nowadays, obviously, the earlier mentioned alternative would be considered a dictatorship in essence.
Yes. And so Canada has a more rosy sort of history of doing treaties, and a lot of Indigenous peoples, they want to see themselves as allies still of the Canadian state, that we're not, it's not like you're above us, we're below you, we're subordinate, but we're brothers, right, in this alliance. You think of the War of 1812, Tecumseh allied with the Crown to defend Canada, right? A lot of people don't realize that. And so evidently, Canada has this history of treaties, but that implies Indigenous rights. And in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, it does say that Aboriginal and treaty rights are hereby recognized and affirmed. So that's the supreme law of Canada. So you never see politicians or corporate CEOs being arrested for violating Aboriginal and treaty rights, which it's implied are recognized and affirmed, or stated unambiguously that are recognized and affirmed in the Canadian Constitution. But the Harper government takes his attitude, his mentor is Tom Flanagan, and he takes his attitude, well, natives are just immigrants here themselves. They came here themselves just like anyone else. They shouldn't have any inherent rights. That's an obstacle to this wonderful job creation that can come from corporations. So there's an abrogation of those Aboriginal rights and an attempt to delegitimate any claims that are made for Aboriginal and treaty rights, even though, you could think of Canada as being kind of like the European Union, where you have different Indigenous nations that negotiate with each other on a nation-to-nation basis. And I think right now there's a system of handouts, right, where, the very poor don't pay tax, the very rich don't pay tax. So you have middle-class Canadians who are encouraged to kind of resent natives getting so-called handouts, right? But, I think the better way to do it would be if you use Canada's abundant resource wealth, that we have the third largest oil reserves in the world, the second largest uranium reserves. If we use Canada's abundant resource wealth and said to Indigenous people, okay, you can have your own Aboriginal oil company, you can have self-determination, right? I mean, this principle of self-determination, that nations should decide their own fate, that if Attawapiskat, the tribe of Attawapiskat, have problems, it should be for the people of Attawapiskat to solve, not for Stephen Harper to meddle in their affairs from Ottawa, right? That principle is not respected by this government in Canada, right? And so those Aboriginal and treaty rights are an obstacle to corporate power, and that's a problem for Harper that he's trying to remove for his corporate friends, it seems.
Now, obviously, I've got to play the devil's advocate here. What I notice, and there's been a lot of discussions, I know a lot of people that work for the Indian Reserves and so forth, and as you were talking about the possibility of Aboriginal, reserves and organizations, the Indigenous people, as you refer to them, having their own sort of in-house oil companies and other means of self-sustainability. Do you believe that would create a risk to relations between Canadians and the Indigenous people, or do you think that they could peacefully coexist? And also, there's obviously a lot of concerns within the Aboriginal folks or the Indigenous people with regards to wealth not being equally distributed, and a lot of the chiefs and leaders of the Indigenous people, as it were, are keeping the wealth at the top, same as the system we have here in Canada, where the wealth is not equally distributed in North American society. So obviously, how do we get around that problem, and how do we make a better life so that the Indigenous people can have self-sustainability, but also not create conflict with Canadians, and at the same time make sure that that self-sustainability is being equally divided amongst the people who are entitled to it, instead of just being reserved at the top for the leaders and the people who are the decision makers, and ultimately creating a same system of government as we have now, where all the people at the top make all the decisions and keep all the money, while the little guys at the bottom have no say.
Yeah, well, as colonialism has always functioned, the colonizers try to buy off and co-opt stooges, and in Spanish they have a word comprador, right, which is like a puppet, right? So they try to cultivate a class of Indians, or in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, you cultivate a monarchy, a corrupt monarchy that will do your dirty work for you, do your bidding for you, and will continue to allow, will sign away resources, sign away rights. And that does happen. I've spoken to people who work for like mining companies and oil companies, and they say, oh, in British Columbia, there's some good Indians who we can work with and some bad Indians. And so it's always a dilemma in colonial context. Do you work within the system and do the best with what the colonial master can offer you, or do you work outside the system? And there are some First Nations people who do very well in this current system, and there's some who don't do very well. But I think that ultimate self-determination will be an approach where people are empowered from the grassroots up, where people are the capital of Canada. I mean, the thing that's difficult to justify in this country, if you're a politician, is that this country is super rich, right? This country has the third largest oil reserves in the world, the second largest uranium reserves, and so on. That's natural wealth. Now, in Britain, for example, where I come from, we have 60 million people and barely any resources. It's hard, to justify certain things there, but not having like free education, not having free healthcare and so on here is really hard to justify when you have all that natural wealth. So currently the natural wealth in Canada, and it's often Indigenous peoples who live in the hinterland, who live in the rural areas of this country. Those people, the Indigenous peoples in those areas, aren't enjoying the wealth that is in their historic territories. And there is a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was declared in 2007. And and that declaration in 2007 was not voted on by New Zealand, voted for by New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the US, because all of them have the skeleton in their closets of the Indigenous question, right? And so you have this situation, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples does speak to the idea that Indigenous people should enjoy some economic self-sufficiency, should enjoy natural resources, right? And we saw like in Africa throughout the Cold War, whenever a genuine, authentic man of the people emerged in different indigenous tribes or in different African countries that wanted to nationalize the resources, right? They wanted to create like a national oil company that stopped British Petroleum, stopped the international oil conglomerates like looting their wealth. They were assassinated, right? So we see that there's always an attempt to, to demarcate between good Indians, or dichotomize between good Indians, good Arabs, bad Arabs, good Iranians, bad Iranians, good. There's always this attempt to cultivate stooges that will do your bidding, and they're treated normally and put on TV and they're respectable. And then you obviously delegitimize and discredit those who are actually men of the people, who are trying to promote nationalization and address the economic questions, right? It's one thing for them to afford cultural rights. Like, Aboriginals have many cultural freedoms in Canada. You could say they can have a powwow when they want. We don't criminalize that necessarily anymore, although sometimes it is happening. But, they can have a round dance and stuff like that. But what is really taboo is to raise the economic questions, right? Where you say, okay, we not only want cultural rights, we want economic rights. We want access to the abundance of wealth that is latent in this country. And that wealth is obviously something that these big corporations, which have the Harper government in their pocket, don't want to see being funneled into Indigenous peoples. So as I say, the notion of Aboriginal rights, it's from the perspective of the Harper government, it's an obstacle that needs to be overcome. So you can clear the way for this corporate takeover of Canada's resources. And it's really quite ridiculous. I mean, only 20% of oil-producing countries don't have a state-owned oil company, don't have nationalized resources. I've even met people who work for like big prominent oil companies here in Calgary who say it's crazy what we do here. We basically just give our resources away in Alberta. If we're going to rape and pillage the environment, surely we should at least use those profits to better society. Ezra Levant, the Sun TV journalist, recently wrote the book Ethical Oil, and he made this case for the Alberta tar sands. For me, even if we grant all what he says, which I don't think it's all accurate, but even if we grant that, the main question is, where do the profits go? The main question isn't, okay, maybe we can use science to reduce environmental damage and we can pull this off, right? The main question is, what happens to the profits? And we saw Hugo Chavez died last week, right? Hugo Chavez's big crime from the perspective of the imperialist powers was that he nationalized, or he used the oil wealth in Venezuela to give it to the people and to use it for social programs rather than to line the pockets of shareholders in private oil companies, right?
And now, obviously, Hugo Chavez is revered for doing this sort of thing. And obviously, do you think that with the amount of resources that we have here in Canada, as far as the oil resources and everything else, that we should just be selling it off? Or do you think that we should implement a state-owned oil company here in Canada, something that's owned by the Crown, that allows, as you said, funding for social programs and adequate budgetary means in order to sustain social programs like healthcare, education, and so forth? Because right now, a lot of people don't know this, but in Alberta, a majority of the public education programs are actually funded by the AGLC and proceeds raised from legalized gambling.